Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum. My name is Fiza Ahmed. I am the student of BDS first year. So today our topic is the blood supply of the brain. The blood supply of the brain is divided into the anterior and the posterior system. The anterior blood supply system of the brain is known as the carotid system. Now I will explain you the carotid system. The carotid system of the blood supply of brain is formed by the internal carotid artery. Here, at the bifurcation of the common carotid artery, a localized dilatation present known as the carotid sinus and the internal carotid artery begin at the bifurcation of the common carotid artery. Then the internal carotid artery ascends the neck and pierces the base of the skull by entering through the carotid canal. Then the internal carotid artery ascends forward and it enters the foramen lacerum, and from the foramen lacerum the internal carotid artery moves toward the cavernous sinus and it appears at the subarachnoid space by piercing the dura mater of the brain. So this was the whole simple pathway of internal carotid artery from the carotid sinus to the cavernous sinus. By reaching at the cavernous sinus, internal carotid artery will give different branches, which are the ophthalmic branch. This ophthalmic branch will enter the eye through the optic canal and it will supply the eye and the orbital structure. Then the internal carotid artery at the terminal bifurcation will give the branch which is known as the posterior communicating artery. This posterior communicating artery will unite with the posterior cerebral artery and play important role in the formation of the circle of Willis. The internal carotid artery also gives rise to the choroidal artery, which will supply the choroid plexus of the third ventricle. At the termination of the cavernous sinus, internal carotid artery will give the two terminal branches, which are anterior cerebral artery and the middle cerebral artery. The anterior cerebral artery of one side of brain connect with the anterior cerebral artery of the other side of the brain through the anterior communicating artery. And this union of two arteries will also contribute in the formation of the circle of Willis. And the middle cerebral artery is the largest artery of the internal carotid artery. So here we are done with the carotid system of blood supply of the brain. Now, let's move toward the posterior blood supply system of the brain, which is the vertebro-basilar system. This system starts with the vertebral artery, which is the branch of the first part of the subclavian artery. This vertebral artery ascends the neck by passing through the foramen of the transverse process of the vertebrae. It ascends through the neck and enters the skull through the foramen magnum and ascends through the medulla oblongata. At the junctions of the pons and the medulla, two vertebral arteries will join and it will give rise to the single artery known as the basilar artery. The branches of the vertebral arteries are: the first branch is the anterior spinal artery. The anterior spinal artery is reinforced by the radicular artery. Now let me explain what is the radicular artery. This is the structure of the spinal cord. The branch of the vertebral artery enters the spinal cord as a segmental artery. As the segmental artery ascends the anterior and posterior root of spinal cord, it is recommended as the anterior and posterior radicular artery respectively. So anterior spinal artery is reinforced by the anterior radicular artery. Vertebral artery also give rise to the posterior inferior cerebellar artery. This artery supplies the cerebellar hemispheres and the velum of the cerebellum. The vertebral artery also gives rise to the small arteries, which are the meningeal artery and the medullary arteries. Now let's move toward the basilar artery. Basilar artery will also give small arteries, which are the pontine arteries. These are the numerous small vessels. Basilar artery also gives rise to the large labyrinthine artery. This labyrinthine artery accompanies with the facial artery and the vestibulocochlear artery to supply the middle ear cavity of the ear. The basilar artery also gives rise to the anterior inferior cerebellar artery and the superior cerebellar artery. And the largest branch of the basilar artery is the posterior cerebral artery. Here we are done with the posterior blood supply system of the brain. Now I will explain you how the anterior blood supply system of the brain and the posterior blood supply system of the brain connect with each other. These two systems are connected with each other through the circle of Willis. Circle of Willis lies at the interpeduncular fossa at the base of brain, and it is formed by the anastomosis of two internal carotid arteries of the carotid system and two vertebral arteries of the vertebrobasilar system. This is the whole structure of the circle of Willis. These are two cavernous sinus. These are the anterior cerebral artery, and the anterior cerebral artery connected with each other through the anterior communicating artery. The cavernous sinus, at the cavernous sinus, internal carotid artery gave posterior communicating artery, which is joined with the posterior cerebral artery. So the anterior communicating artery and the posterior communicating artery take part in the formation of the circle of Willis. Here we are end with the blood supply of the brain.